podcast where poets talk.
I'm your host, Sanna Wani.
And I'm your host, Jody Chin. Our guest today is joining from Winnipeg on the land known as Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral lands and future lands because land back of the Anishinaabeg, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, Dene Sulene, and the Haitawik nations. In our conversation today, we'll delve into the ways that law and the language of law can operate as a colonial tool, preserving the power of the state and silencing histories of resistance and presence. In an April 2024 interview on Al Jazeera's podcast Center Stage, the Palestinian-American lawyer, legal scholar, and professor Noura Erakat says that justice comes through people, as it always has and always will. She says the most unjust regimes are very lawful, and that we as the people are the ones who can mobilize the tools at our disposal, including but not limited to law and political struggle. We see this playing out in the most devastating way right now, in the fact that as of the date of this recording, it's been 6 days since the UN General Assembly adopted a quote-unquote historic resolution aiming to enforce the ICJ's July ruling that Israel's occupation and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank is unlawful. The resolution demands that Israel end its occupation, return all land stolen since 1967, pay reparations to Palestinians, and evacuate settlers from Palestine. But this being a non-binding resolution and ruling in the first place, Israel continues to flaunt its impunity in the face of international law. Yesterday, on September 23rd, Israel killed nearly 500 people in one day in Lebanon and has displaced hundreds of thousands. So we bring all of this, necessary context and subtext, into our conversation about law today, so that the question we orient ourselves towards is not how can law, or quote-unquote rule-based society, alone move us toward a world free from colony and empire, but what other ways of being together, what other forms of governance can we dream of, and what does poetry have to do with any of it?
Joining us to talk about law is the poet, writer, and editor based in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Chimwemwe Undi. Chim is a lawyer and renowned spoken-word poet whose poem, A History of Houses Built Out of Spite, is still performed by students across Canada through poetry and voice. Her spoken word has also been featured in the Canadian Festival of Spoken Word and the Edinburgh International Book Festival, as well as in magazines such as Brick, Border Crossings, and Canadian Literature. She's an editor with CV2, the Winnipeg Poet Laureate, and the winner of the 2022 John Hirsch Emerging Manitoba Writer Award with the Manitoba Book Awards. She was named one of CBC Manitoba's 2020 Future 40, and her first book of poetry, Scientific Marvel, was released with House of Anansi Press in 2024. Taking a break because that's a lot of impressive, like celebration emoji, impressive emoji, like deep sigh emoji for trials and tribulations, turmoils. All of these accolades and incredible achievements aside, what makes Chim Undi so special to me is the kind of friend she is. The absolute marvel of a person. The absolute marvel of a person. And anyone who knows Chim knows how she shines, how it feels to be in her presence, and how it feels to be in the room with her when she performs. I have had the good luck and fortune to have met her in 2019 and to call her a good friend. To know her is to love her, and here's what I love to know of her. Dignified and valiant member of the Bayhive, known lover of the prairies and of Winnipeg, general genius and expert on love and tenderness, and founder and foundational to my own personal definition of what it means to be a hot girl. Here's to my incredibly funny, quietly wise, sharply observant, and intentionally loving friend. Welcome, Chim!
Aww. I'm so happy to be here. Well, to start us off, Chim, would you like to read us a poem? Sure. I brought two. One that I wrote and one that somebody else wrote. I'll start with someone else. This poem is from Donika Kelly's 2021 collection, The Renunciations. It's called My Father Visits the Oracle Before I Am Born. He expects a vision of his own death, body opened as his mother's, abrupt and with mercy. He expects the barrel of the gun. He expects exile in a closet. He expects, in short, a truncated life. By now, he knows intervention is only postponement. He asks, and the oracle answers. Afterward and forever, he disavows his body as something he can control.
Do you want to tell us a bit about what you love about this poem, or why you chose to bring it to us today?
Yeah, I'm thinking, well, yesterday I went to the book launch of the book by my friend Jenny Wells, who's written her second kind of collection of what she calls life writing. So the genre of like memoir and nonfiction, and in her case, sort of lyrical writing and academic writing, all sort of mixed together. And kind of predictably, I guess I think a lot about rules. And that poem, well, structurally the poem sort of breaks some rules, I think, by withholding information that is promised, is prefaced by, he asks the oracle and the oracle answers. But also, I think about the kind of rules or structures that govern family and other kinds of relational operations like cities and countries and friendships. And that's my best explanation. That's interesting that you brought up, the rules of a poem or withholding information. I loved how you read that part. And I read this collection and I didn't remember this poem specifically. Sort of has a quietness to it in the midst of a collection that I feel like is very, very emotional, very kind of forwardly, actively processing a lot of the things that happen in that relationship, right, between Donika Kelly and her father. But the silence and the weightiness of the pause that you gave it while you were reading, kind of indicating like the presence of that information, but that the poet is actually, it's holding it back, or not divulging it. I'm curious why you chose that poem out of that collection, actually. That's a great, your kind of comment about the importance of silence in that poem, I think it's occurring to me as I'm talking, which is how I talk, that I am currently very interested in silence, like in all sorts of forms of silence. And there's a way that sort of erasure visited on a text that already exists is sort of silencing things around and bringing forward whatever forms the poem. But I don't think of that as a silencing. I think of it as an amplifying of subtext through erasure. That's sort of erasure of blackening around the text. But in that poem, the silence is a form of information also. Our attention is drawn to the silence in a way that I think is important in the context of that information, or in the context of that poem. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about in all sorts of contexts right now. I love that, erasure not as silencing, but as amplification of what's there. It feels also important in the context of that collection, making silence about childhood sexual abuse. And that feels really, poignant. Thank you.
And I feel like we're going to talk about rules a lot, maybe in our conversation, like what makes a rule. And I mean, if we're thinking about anything from family to friends to any intimate or intense relationship, a silent rule is often a really powerful one. Like that's what your thoughts around this poem are making me think about, that quiet, that certain withholdings are instructional, and those instructions are often like the most important ones. In certain relationships, especially that are imbued with like power, like top-down type of power or power coming down on you and authority, being silent is often like really not damaging, but just like really harder to grapple with maybe.
Yeah, that's true. And it occurs to me that sort of part of what I like and find comforting about the law is that it is express, or at least when I first kind of became interested in the law and turned towards it as sort of part of my career path, I was interested in the rules that we do write down, because I can say in a like very colonized by English African family, and then also in general, like as an immigrant, there are all sorts of silent rules that are not, there's no sort of resource that you can turn to explain those rules to you, and yet those rules are so important. And so part of what I found interesting and in some ways comforting about the law was that there were these rules that were written down. It's what we had decided upon in various ways, and we is maybe generous, but they were rules that govern. And so I think what a thing to then learn about all of the silences that exist in the law too.
What motivated you to study the law? But I'm really interested in a question that I think precedes that. That's in some of the like interviews and things you've done, and just in knowing you as a friend, I know as well. But I think you did like a master's in linguistics on the institutional power of language. So I'd love to know about that journey. Like what started that? How did it go? Sorry. I really do want to know how it went though.
Just the slow fade on that question. Perfect. I did my undergraduate degree in linguistics and sociology here in Manitoba at the University of Manitoba. And I was a kid who asked a lot of questions, and I was a good writer, and I was stubborn, and those were kinds of elements of a child that make adults tell that child that they should go to law school. And so when I was sort of in high school and people were like, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? I would say I wanted to be a lawyer. but I didn't know any lawyers. I had no kind of real sense of what it looked like to be a lawyer. I got to the U of M, and I started studying kind of all sorts of things. I was doing an arts degree, and I took a bunch of intro classes. And it seemed to me that in linguistics I could study through something I already loved, which was language. That I could study history and sociology and anthropology. I could think about art and politics. That there was sort of an avenue for everything inside of linguistics. And I was fortunate that there were scholars at the U of M who were thinking about language and society kind of in a different way that I wanted to, but thinking kind of expressly about how we use language as a weapon and as a tool. And I decided to go to graduate school, and I went to Toronto, to York University, and the program that they have there is sort of well known for having scholars that are interested in institutional language use more the way that I was interested in it, which is how it preserves power for the powerful and how it justifies that preservation. And I sort of studied under linguists who had done really good and important work on this issue. But it was really clear to me that I would not sort of be satisfied working on hypothetical problems, that I wanted to be in the work of thinking about the law as it applied to people who needed somebody to think about the law in that moment, who needed answers that affected their lives at that time. And also one of my mentors at York had said, I've had a great career. I've done a lot of good research. I wish I had just gone to law school in the first place. I would have done much more what I wanted my linguistic work to do. I would have been able to do through the law.
If I can begin with like a follow-up question, you kind of touched on this as you're speaking about studying linguistics and what that taught you about language. And I wondered if you wanted to say any more about that. You were saying language as a weapon and a tool, the way that it preserves power for the powerful. I'm curious what being in law school and studying law from linguistics, what did studying law teach you about language? And then also, if you want to tie that back to poetry, I'm curious about that too, kind of how that shows up in poetry.
Yeah, those are big questions. I mean, the sort of baseline that we're starting from is that I really love and am fascinated by language, and the way that a linguist thinks about language and the way a poet thinks about language and the way a lawyer thinks about language are, I think, very different. But I think all of those groups of people, all of which I belong to, understand that language does things in the world, that it is not, well, it's obviously not neutral, but it moves and changes the world. It's a force in the world, the way that language works. Linguistics, I think I took a really kind of traditional linguistics degree, which is kind of about the science of language. And then my master's was more sociolinguistic leaning. So understanding, how sounds work and how a sentence is structured from a scientific perspective, I think was just really interesting for me. But it was the kind of the place where sociology and linguistics overlapped that I was really interested in, which is about people and how our own use of language shapes the life that we have, and how language used by other people also shapes the life that we have. I was very interested in that. My master's thesis, when I was in grad school, I got really good at explaining what my master's thesis was about. It's been a few years, but I was interested in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, and in something sort of a linguistic concept called the text trajectory, which is what it sounds like. It's the movement of text from its source and into other places. And well, I won't get too into the nitty gritty of it, but that's exactly what happens in the law. Is that language originates somewhere, typically in like a decision by a judge, and then it is removed from that original context with the specific background from which it arose, and it is applied as precedent to a new set of circumstances. And yeah, I find that really fascinating. It makes it really difficult for things to change in the law, because the justification for what is happening is that it's already happened. And imagine the problems with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and poetry, I mean, what I love about poetry is that I think every single thing that I do or read or ask about or come to understand affects the poetry that I write. It's the site at which all of the threads of my life converge.
Do you think there's something like a text trajectory to poetry? Like, what do you think of like the logics of poetry? For yourself, just in your own ars poetica, how do you think a poem moves, if it does, in parallel to the way you've learned, like the way the law moves?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think in some ways the text trajectory is just a very identifiable phenomenon that explains a thing that happens more subtly and in a less identifiable way, which is to say that like everything I've ever read ends up in everything I ever write. Everything I've ever seen and everything I ever write in some way. And I'm thinking about your question both from like other people's writing being pulled out of its context and put into my own writing. I read a poem by somebody who's definitely not talking about what I'm thinking about. Like their poem pulls out of me something that I'm sure they didn't or couldn't have anticipated, and then that leads to a new poem. That's kind of a removal from context. And then kind of more honestly, I'm a vulture of my own writing. Like I write a lot of stuff. I write like much more than I publish, and I'll be like, oh, I think I had a good line that would work here, and I'll like go back into my old work. Like, I'm just gonna take this. It's not going nowhere, so I'm gonna take the best part of it, and we can figure it. So there's that kind of trajectory too.
I love that, a vulture of your own work.
Yeah, I love that too. Sounds kind of like citation working in different ways, maybe too, is what I'm hearing. Like in a legal context, text trajectory being future or present cases citing a precedent in order to justify some sort of decision or violence or enforcing of some sort just because it's happened before and all the problems that's associated with, as you're saying. And then in poetry, in the way you're describing your own practice, sounds more like a constellating of influences. It's not like a causal relationship or a justification for existence, per se. It just, here's the things I've read or taken in that have shaped me in my writing.
A thought that I'm having is about, during my anthropology degree, we talked a lot about the word context and the way text was baked into the word. And I think that came up a lot because of the ways that, not language, but a certain like textualization, script maybe, was baked and written again into like the ways we understood the world in that particular discipline, which I think parallel other disciplines because it's all like white Western academic, blah, blah, blah.
That's really interesting. And I'll say as an aside, linguists mostly are purists about spoken language. And it was, well, at least when I was doing my undergraduate degree, which would have been like, I began in 2012, the sort of, the work of being a linguist was really focused on spontaneous spoken and signed language, because the idea is that that would tell us more about how language worked than prepared text, which we were sort of laboring over. And I think there's sort of a logic to that, in that if for some sort of branches of the field, people were trying to understand how like a baby acquires language, spontaneous language tells us more than kind of reading and writing might. But for me, I was really drawn to prepared text because I'm interested in the choices that that go into preparing those texts.
Well, speaking of the difference between spoken and written language, I'm so impressed and curious about the fact that you work in both spoken word, or maybe worked past tense. I don't know actually how you relate to spoken word now, but work and have worked in spoken and page poetry. And I would love to hear more about how both of those came into your life.
Sure. So I came to a poetry practice through spoken word and through the slam, which is a competition that spoken word artists participate in. And that is like where I found a poetry community here in Winnipeg, is that there was at that time, and apparently I learned today again, a really active poetry slam community. And it was like the first place in my life where I could like go to a bar and there would be a bunch of poets and we would be doing poems and thinking about poetry. And I like am very grateful for a background in spoken word. Yeah, spoken word provided me with tools in writing poems and obviously in performing them. So I'm like very grateful that I'm like very comfortable on a stage, because I've when I started, the only way that I ever shared a poem, the only way that somebody ever heard a poem that I wrote, was because I was performing it for them. My specific experience with the slam community was not entirely positive. For a lot of reasons. As like a young Black woman, and that can be hard. And there were sort of dynamics within the community that were quite toxic for me. So that's on a community level. On a writing level, thinking about my audience too much was really really hard for me. It made me a very sort of timid writer in a way that timid as opposed to careful. And so that was hard for me. And so I'd always been interested in publishing, but I started to focus more on what I could do on the page, having sort of a separation between myself and the poem as a thing that exists in the world. And writing for the page is very different, again, because of the reader's access to the text of the poem. And there are things that are possible, like erasure poems, like sort of other formal things that don't translate necessarily when you're reading them out loud, as opposed to the writer reading them. The differences between spoken word and page poetry beyond that, I don't know. It kind of seems a little made up, like most binaries. There was a while where sometimes someone would say spoken word poet, and I think they meant black. So here we are. But there's certainly a strong tradition of spoken word artists that is black and brown people, tied to hip hop, but not always. And obviously, page poetry is page poetry. But I think, especially in recent years, the kind of division between those two things, hard for me to say.
You mentioned some different forms of poems maybe that you've been working with, or that translate in page poetry in a different way than what would maybe be possible in spoken word. And I'd love to talk more about the erasure poems in Scientific Marvel, actually, if that's okay. But yeah, so in the book, there's a series of blackout poems, erasure poems, where you're working with these court documents from 3 separate cases. And yeah, I'd love to just hear a bit more about your process with those poems and your intention, thinking about some things you said earlier around erasure as kind of a form of making present. And it also made me think of, I did taiko drumming for a few years and stopped recently, but through that practice, one of the things that I learned, we thought a lot about silence, and silence not as an absence, but a form of presence, both kind of in contrasting with the sound or the noise or the music when it was there, as a way of marking time, a way of marking breath, a way of communicating or signaling to co-drummers. So thinking a lot about silence in those terms. And you also said blackening, and I was thinking about just like the visual presence and form of these poems, how it does that in such a concrete way of making clear what that erasure is, or where the silencing is happening. So yeah, I'd love to just hear, maybe also how you're feeling about those poems now, these days, when you think back on them, and your process of creating them.
Yeah, so the erasure poems in the collection are erasures of decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada where the affected person, so in the criminal cases, the accused, and in the civil cases, I think, plaintiff in both instances, or the appellant, were black people. But their blackness is not sort of sometimes mentioned at all, or in all cases meaningfully considered as part of the text of the decision, as part of the reasoning, the way that the court gets from the facts to the conclusion. And what I wanted to do was to make the subtext of their blackness the text of the poem, to like I said, amplify what I think cannot be absent but can be silent. And I did that by doing a blackout poem, and quite literally blackening the page, making most of the text black. So when you look at it, it is a black. It's more black than white on the page, which I liked. And also, I used redaction software to make the poems, which I thought was also more for me, but it was like a cool way of doing it. The silence is an epidemic in the law. There's all sorts of unspoken, like all sorts of history of the law that was unspoken until very recently. Circumstances of the people who are being affected by the law that is silent because it is not strictly relevant within the framework of what we consider relevant in the law. And I mean, part of the kind of genesis of these poems was being a law student and sitting in a classroom and reading. I mean, one of the cases is about a stop and frisk in Toronto, and being sort of baffled that a room of very smart people could have that conversation without talking about the fact that the person was black. It felt to me like, well, then what are we actually talking about if we're not talking about the fact that this is a black guy who was stopped by some cops who thought he maybe looked suspicious? You know, what world are we living in where that's not an important thing to grapple with?
And also, yeah, as you're talking about silence being an epidemic in the law, in the parallel, but something similar about the way
that language is removed from context, like the scene that you're describing of, a bunch of law students sitting there talking about this case and not being able, or not wanting, deciding not to name blackness as a part of the context of what's going on, or what's being talked about. I have a follow-up question. I'm remembering reading the notes section, or the acknowledgements of Scientific Marvel, which usually I read first in a book, and in reference to one of those poems you cited, I think a paper by Dr. Amar Kode of Black Voices Matter Too, counter-narrating Smithers v. the Queen, one of the cases, or one of the decisions that you're working with. And I was just curious about that counter-narrating, whether that feels like an ethic or a way of naming your approach to that erasure practice, or just your relationship with that text.
Yeah, so Dr. Kode was one of my professors in law school. Actually, didn't have him until the second year. And he wrote an article that is, it's one of the decisions that I interact with in the collection. And he did sort of what I wanted to do by zooming out, expanding the frame. The counter narrative was introducing the context back into the decision, like talking about Smithers. And if there's lawyers listening to this, I don't practice criminal law, so I'm not going to talk about it. But Smithers is a case that has to do with the facts of the case have to do with a black hockey player, like a young man who played on a team with white people, and he assaulted one of the hockey players that he worked with, or that he played with. And what the counter narrative does is detail the race-based violence and harassment that Smithers had been enduring up until the point that he assaulted his teammate, or I think the person was on the other team. The sports stuff I don't know about. And so, Dr. Kode's work gave me a sort of permission to do the same thing, kind of expand the world in which the legal decision is rendered, to sort of insist upon talking about what the law has decided is not relevant to sort of the analysis that leads us to the result.
We've been talking about law towards people, but then people towards law. There's also silences in that direction too, that I was thinking when you were talking about counter-narrating, that being kind of like plucked or probed by that practice.
Maybe we can actually broaden the conversation here, use it as a bit of a transition to think about, I'm wondering if there's anything, that comes to mind too, about the different ways that law versus poetry uses language, the uses of language in each, or how language moves through those different worlds.
It's a hard question, because my understanding of the law and my understanding of poetry are constantly changing and developing every day. At this moment, in September 2024, what I am thinking about, sort of, I think of my practice of poetry as a force in my life that insists that I attend to the world, that I pay attention to the world around me, that I ask questions and notice and think deeply. And what can I say about this? I don't think that the law always rewards that. Like, it's not, there is room for nuance in the law, but nuance is not always fruitful. It's a place where certainty is really rewarded, and I really value my uncertainty in my poetic practice. Because from me, with that uncertainty comes sort of curiosity and an openness. But when you call a lawyer and ask them for help, it's very important that they are reasonably certain.
I wanted to share a few lines from a poem that I happened to be reading earlier today that felt very fitting for this conversation, and we'll see. I was curious about what you both would think. I've been reading Danez Smith's new collection, Bluff, and the first poem in the collection is part of a series from the book called Anti-Poetica, and this one kind of positions, I think, freedom against poetry, but also poetry against the law. And there's a few lines in there that go, "There's no poem free from money's ruin, no poem in the capital nor the court. Most policy rewords a devil's script. There is no poem in the law." It's just really, I'm curious about what you both think around this relationship between poem, law, freedom, where they kind of work with each other, against each other.
This is actually what this is bringing up for me is maybe, yeah, I'm interested in kind of contrasting in my mind what you said earlier, Chim, about poetry attending to the world and particularly being interested in uncertainty, and law not being interested in that, or law being something that is almost antithetical maybe to that. And then also thinking about, yeah, poetry's relationship maybe with ruin, and how I think this is very generous to poetry. I think, I don't know, lately I found it kind of enticing to be less generous towards poetry. Jody actually ran a workshop called A Poem is Not a Revolution, that I think began this interest for me in thinking about the limits of poetry.
That's interesting. I'm thinking about, the title of that workshop, A Poem is Not a Revolution, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Is so apt. Because for me, well, I have no expectation that my poem will revolutionize. But what I rely on poetry for is, in my own writing, is to clarify and articulate my values and concerns and priorities, and then to learn the same thing from other people's poems, and also to there's sort of like a solidarity. I don't know, like being a poet is not my identity, but it is in many ways my community, the people that I respect as thinkers in the world. A lot of them are poets, and yeah, poetry has really shaped my thinking. And so I think I try to be really aware of the limits of a poem. Like if I write a poem about freeing Palestine, and I don't go to protests or donate money or engage in mutual aid or do anything tangible in the world, then my poem it sort of is a useless object. But if the act of writing that poem solidifies for me what it is that I know that I need to do, then I think that's an effective use of, or an effective relationship between poetry and revolution.
Yeah, I think that feels very resonant to the way that Sanna and I have talked about poetry also in the past, of poetry or people who write poetry being a community or an ecosystem of people whose ethic or thinking or way of being we respect and want to be close to or building kinship with. And then what you're saying too of maybe an asterisk on that, the poets that I feel connected or in community with, like poets who acknowledge and think deeply about the limitations or constraints of language and what it does in the world. And at the same time, I agree with something you said earlier, Jim, around language having force or language as a force. I think that's also true. And maybe that's a question that I'm like coming back to always. And that was part of that workshop. Like, what is the force then? Even if, not least of which is that internal force to clarify or to realign kind of action with value internally. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that reminds me too of something you said way at the beginning of our conversation, Chim, about what was it? I think it was that linguists and poets and lawyers could agree that language does something. Like maybe they won't like look at what it's doing in the same way, but that it's related to that doing.
Yeah. There's like a framework of understanding how people understand each other when they speak. They're called Grice's maxims, and I can't remember what all of them are, but it's sort of a framework of articulating what is understood but unsaid between people, and those understood and unsaid things are necessary for people to communicate effectively and to understand each other. One of them is about the maxim of relevance, which is that if somebody asks you a question, if somebody asks you, oh, what time is it? And you answer, it looks like the sun is setting. That without the mutual understanding that whatever a person responds to you is relevant to what you just asked, that is an exchange that doesn't make any sense. But because of that mutual understanding, then we know, well, you're telling me that it's getting dark outside as an indication that the time in the day, you don't know the exact time, but it is late enough that the sun is starting to go down. And that's just an example of like linguists thinking, using language to think about language, but also to think about silence, what is not expressed, not necessarily said. Yeah, and I think that sort of training has been really useful for me in what I try to do in poetry.
And it strikes me that, again, painting with very broad strokes, no, neither poets nor lawyers should cite me on this, but that that maxim is so essential to how poetry works, that there has to be some faith or trust in relevance or connection or association, that the way the poem moves has its own logic, even if it's not immediately apparent, or even if the rule does not need to be spoken or understood in the same explicit way, but not very conducive to how the law works. You wouldn't just go, trust me.
I think that's so apt, Jody, because like the number one thing you hear from people who don't engage with poems is, oh, like, I don't understand, or like, this doesn't make sense to me, which I feel like is picking up on maybe that maxim exactly as well, like this thought of relevance, like how does this thing connect to this thing, where poetry really widens the gap between that and plays with that a lot. Like it really likes to mess with that sense, that unspoken sense, in order to make its own kind of findings known, or its own logic's apparent.
I agree with that. I don't know. It's so interesting to be asked questions about like the relationship between linguistics and law and poetry. And I think, they're good questions, and I think there's a lot of interesting ground to be excavated there. But like, if we're being so real, like I was in high school and I wrote poems, and then I went to university, and I was like, I gotta study something, and I picked a major, and I had like a crush on the professor that taught linguistics.
Perfect.
Taylor's all this time.
Linguistics, and I was working at a job at an office, just googling jobs for linguists and being like, oh boy, we gotta really fast. And I was like, I'm gonna go to law school, classic cleansing of an arts degree through a law degree.
Classic.
And I can think now in hindsight about the kind of threads that were pulling me in different directions. But I didn't like sit down at 16 and be like, here's all of the ways I'm going to develop an understanding of language.
Truly Taylor's oldest time. I also developed a crush on my professor and decided my degree that way too.
It's very effective.
It just works. Got straight A's, honestly.
Okay, show off.
Beautiful.
But in hindsight, I'm also like, well, not to put meaning onto everything. I was told recently that I'm not frivolous enough, and I attach too much purpose to facts that are actually not that important.
That's like every poet.
Every poet, yeah.
But I'm also like, well, it also tells us something that you're sitting in that spot, and being a lawyer was the thing that is more maybe financially viable or societally rewarded, and the way that law uses language, like why is a poet not that kind of that place in society? Not that we should like invert the hierarchy or anything like that. Like a world organized according to different rules or different values, maybe a poet would have been the thing. You brought another poem, which is your own poem, and I'd love to have space for that, to read and then also to talk about it.
Sounds great. So this poem is the opening poem in Scientific Marvel. It's called Property 101. This I know how to do. Reduce a person to their facts, unsympathetic to condition, either useful or distinct. Good practice is dissolving my beloved into traits, serving the language that I serve and work against to deep. I am advised that an example of violence is not violence, like a photograph in a museum, transformed by the lens and then by display. Because I am advised, I turn advisory, surmise the gaps were not openings through which to shine my particular night, dark as the din of this country's measured silence. This is to say, I am learning about property in a recent nation where no one looks me in the eye. What spectacle elides by calling itself analysis? Hallways riddled with exits, each an error to pass.
Thank you. Yeah, I love this poem too. When I was reading your collection and this was the opening, I was like, okay, here we go. Buckle in. Wondering if you want to say anything about why you chose this poem for today, or why you wanted to read it today.
What do I say about that poem? The experience of learning about property, which in the common law system is so foundationally colonial that a lot of the very early decisions have to do with enslaved people in the Atlantic slave trade, is a real trip. It is really bizarre. And in that poem, I'm sort of thinking about the work of working with language in the law, but also in the collection that follows and in my poetic practice, and the kind of the many violences that have contributed to me writing the way that I write in the language that I write.
What you were just saying, Chim, it makes me, this line has always really stuck with me from the first time I read it, and then every time I hear it also, that good practice is dissolving my beloved into traits, serving the language that I serve and work against. All the contradictions kind of inherent in this poem, in this collection, of that learning about violence or articulating violence can be in itself violence or an example of it, and yet still kind of working with this language, the force or power that it has. So trying to use language as a lawyer too, and to enact in the world in that way, feels like. I wonder if you see it this way, like an ars poetica for the book, or be a bit of a statement around like kind of relationship with language, and the rest of the book thinking about the way that property also like shows up again and again as both a metaphor but also like a real kind of material relation in your writing. Yeah.
I certainly, with a lot of help from the people at Anansi, because putting in order to the book was like mind breaking for me. But it did feel like a way to open the book that felt like an honest preview of what my preoccupations are in the rest of it. And I'll say the sort of Easter egg of this poem and the poem that end the book are that I was like very obsessed with Tarantes. Well, I still am obsessed with Tarantes. And so I don't actually know if they're still American sonnets, but when I wrote them, they were intended to be, or at least they both started as American sonnets, which I thought was also a lot of inside jokes that are just inside of my head. Starting a book that is like really about Canada in a lot of ways with an American.
When you read the first poem too, I had this thought, and now it's coming up again, so I want to share it. But I once did a mentorship with Eduardo C. Corral, and one of the most wonderful things he taught me was that every poem has good secrets. Every poem is very good at keeping secrets. And I thought of that when we talked about Donika Kelly's work, and now I'm thinking about that again as we talk about your own relationship to the work, but also maybe like the work's relationship to itself or something like that, like the poem liking to keep its secrets or something in that vein. And I think one of the things I admire the most about your poetry is rhythm. I think you're so good at rhythm, and the way the poem moves is particularly, I feel like, measured and careful. And I love falling into that with you. Where it says, I'm advised, because I am advised, I turn to advisory. This I know how to do. This is to say, I'm learning about property in a recent nation. There's just a way that you measure out, you give such careful pieces to the reader. And then I really, in light of our conversation, which now I'm like, should we rename this poet Talk About Silence? But I don't know, we'll keep it. But Hallways Riddled with Exits caught my ear really deeply.
Sanna, as you were talking just now, you said careful a few times, careful and measured, which is something I hear in this poem too. And earlier, Chim, you were drawing a distinction between timid and careful. That's the way that you had felt at one point in your poetry life. I'm wondering how you relate to careful as a descriptor of your work, or as you as a poet.
I think of myself as a careful writer, and not to sound like a Instagram meme, but like as full of care. Both in terms of like I try to be careful and pay close attention to the words. Like that for me is like part of the fun of being a poet, is kind of moving stuff around and figure out a way to put it together. And I care an exhausting amount about poems and about the world that inspires the poems. So yeah, careful.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode on Law with us and our special guest, Chimwemwe Undi.
To keep up with Chim, follow her on her Instagram at chim.undi or visit her website, chimwemweundi.com. This month, we also want to shout out No Arms in the Arts, a campaign that was launched to demand that Scotiabank fully divest from Israeli arms manufacturer Albit Systems, working through the points of leverage that artists and cultural workers have through our organizations and institutions, a way for artists and cultural workers to take their craft and their language off the page. You can follow the different organizations that are part of the No Arms in the Arts campaign via Writers Against the War on Gaza on Instagram, Filmworkers for Palestine, Artists Against Art Washing, and Canlit Response.
If you like this episode, I encourage you to share it with poet and non-poet friends alike, and to please leave a review, comment, or rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening.
Don't forget to follow us too so you don't miss our next episode.
Poet Talk is produced and created by me, Sanna Wani,
and co-hosted by me, Jody Chen.
The show music includes songs from the album Elise's Awesome Dance Adventure by Komiku, including Elise's theme as the intro and a calm moment to remember before taking the dangerous road as the outro. The transitional music is an anarchist utopia and that weird feeling when you understand that you are alone and the only hope. You can learn more about Komiku at loyaltyfreakmusic.com.
For more information and to support Poet Talk, you can visit our website, poettalk.buzzsprout.com, or follow us on our Instagram at Talk